Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations.
Bring 'em home.
Bring all troops back from overseas. Bring 'em home. Bring 'em home.
It will make the general sad, I know. Bring 'em home. Bring 'em home. They want to tangle with the foe. Bring 'em home.
Vietnam, one of the worst mistakes made by the U.S. It has marred the U.S. with tales of protesters getting beaten and killed simply because they wanted the truth and they wanted the U.S. out of Vietnam. These protesters were surprisingly diverse, ranging from the elderly to the boisterous youth. They both shared a common goal. They wanted to end Vietnam. However, some of these protesters had to lay down their lives in order to make their point known and heard. The worst incident occurred at Kent State College when the National Guardsmen were sent in to break up the ruckus. For some unknown reason, the National Guardsmen opened fire on the students. 4 students were killed in the crossfire. 2 were protesters and the other 2 were just innocent victims. But college students were not the only ones getting injured and killed in protests. Many adults were also harmed while they were protesting. However, there was another side to protesting in Vietnam. It was through music. Examples of songs that helped with the protests against the Vietnam War include What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, released in 1971, War by Edwin Starr, released in 1969, and All Along the Watchtower by Bob Dylan, released in 1968. With songs like these being released, the Vietnam War was seen in a different light. Even those who heavily supported the war were forced to take a look at what was going on in the world.
I'm not really a pacifist. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. If an army invaded this land of mine, bring 'em home, bring 'em home. You'd find me out on the firing line. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. Show those generals a fallacy. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. They don't have the right weaponry. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. For defense you need common sense. Bring 'em home, bring 'em home. They don't have the...
In the Civil Rights Movement, there was a huge movement of music which was created in order to inspire black pride and hopefully persuade people to join the fight. Songs that had a heavy influence in the movement include Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud by James Brown, released in 1968. Love Child by Diana Ross and the Supremes, also released in 1968. We Shall Overcome by Pete Seeger, released in 1947. And This Little Light of Mine by Harry Dixon Loso, released in 1920. Even though all these songs weren't released during the protests, they were still responsible for driving the civil rights movement forward. As with the Vietnam War protests, there was also another side to the protest for civil rights. It started with people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. Parks and King and many more were responsible for the beginnings of the non-musical side to the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for peaceful protests. However, he too, like the Kent State College victims, laid down his life in order to get his point across. Rosa Parks was also a contributor because she helped fuel the bus boycotts when she was arrested for not giving up her seat to a white man. Once again, like in the Vietnam War protests, violence was used against the protesters. Things like dogs and fire hoses were used against the peaceful protesters that marched. Although that type of violence was never needed during the protests, it was used anyway. As seen through both the Vietnam War protests and the Civil Rights Movement, powerful rallies and demonstrations helped to shape their outcomes. In the case of the Vietnam War protests, demonstrations included burning draft cards and skipping the draft. However, music was also another method to spread the message of protesting. As for the Civil Rights Movement, the demonstrations included sit-ins, boycotts, and marches. Either way, in the case of the Vietnam War protests or the Civil Rights Movement, powerful rallies and demonstrations helped to create positive outcomes for both movements.